Conscient Podcast, episode 183. Artistic leaders Devyani, Saltzman, Evalyn, Parry, Shannon, Litzenberger, Kelly Langgard, and Michael Murray.
You know, something that I've been thinking about a lot is the importance of connecting the value of the arts to everyday citizens, to and their own connection to creativity, whatever that might be. I think it's something we should be working on now. It's something that we should be talking about, not only within our communities and within the arts sector, but outside of as well. Talking about the value of the arts to things like feelings of belonging and feelings of connection, and the ability to build bridges that the arts so uniquely has.
I agree with Kelly that the arts have the capacity to build bridges and deepen feelings of belonging. I also think that the arts have a lot of influence and responsibility in our changing world, as you're about to hear. So welcome to a special episode of the Conscient Podcast, brought to you by the Public Imagination Network and Mass Culture. You'll hear a 90-minute conversation between the 5 guests I mentioned, but also the audience, on the theme of cultural leadership in a changing world. It took place on June 5th, 2024, on Zoom, and those 100 participants now get a chance to hear it again, as well as the general public. So, who's who? The conversationalists were Public Imagination Network Fellows Devyani Saltzman, Evalyn, Parry, and Shannon Litzenberger, alongside of Kelly Langgard, who is Director and CEO of the Toronto Arts Council, and Michael Murray, CEO of the Ontario Arts Council, Conseil des Arts de l'Ontario. Now, you might know that the Public Imagination Network is a group of leading artists and thinkers who are passionate about creative responses to issues of public governance and social justice. And you can hear more about the origins of the Public Imagination Network, also known as PIN, from my March 28, 2024 conversation with Shannon Litzenberger, episode 160 of this podcast. This event was co-hosted with Mass Culture, Mobilisation Culturelle, which is an arts support organization that strives to harness the power of research to learn and generate new insights, enabling the arts community to be strategic, focused, and adaptive. Mass Culture is led by Robin Sokolowski, who was my guest on this podcast in episode 61 back in 2021, but who will also be a guest for a second conversation this summer, so stay tuned for that. So what is cultural leadership? I think it's a lot of different things, but during the conversation, Shannon Litzenberger offered this definition, which I think is a good point of departure.
But I think about leadership as our ability to respond generatively to what a moment is asking of us in service of collective thriving. So it's got a lot of layers to it, but it's about, our ability to respond. What are we responding to? How are we attuning to a moment? Like, are we just seeing what we're conditioned to see? Are we attuned to what's in the foreground, the arrangements in the background that are producing the condition that we're inside of? And are our decisions, are our responses, are they in service of collective thriving? And I think, to me, this is the big moment of relational turn that leadership needs to understand now.
And I think the emphasis on what we are in tune with in this moment is particularly important. So to the organizers' credit, this event was not a one-way conversation. That audience of about 100 were invited to participate through a series of Zoom chat storms. I don't know if you've ever had a chat storm event, but it's quite something. It's basically when all the comments and questions are held back until the end of a series of presentations and all released at once. And it sort of sounds like this. And it was quite overwhelming to read them all at once, but a lot of fun, because there's so many different points of view and so much energy generated by the responses to presentations. And so you'll be able to hear some of those comments read by the conversationalists and also their comments and responses to questions. So it's quite dynamic that way. Now, to make it easier to navigate, I've broken the episode into 6 parts. And you'll hear, in between each section, there's a short excerpt of a soundscape composition of mine from 1998 called Au dernier vivant les biens. Okay, so before we jump in, I need to be honest and say that my only critique of this event was that we didn't get to talk very much about the climate emergency or the ecological crisis, which of course is an area of interest of this podcast. But Evalyn Parry did mention at the end of the session that we should have a separate session on this topic and include it more regularly, and I think that's in the works. And it's actually good to have multiple and contrasting conversation about these complex issues, be it leadership or capacity or social justice or even societal collapse. And because they are all interconnected and all require our attention, but maybe not all at once. We can catch our breath and we can connect the dots as we listen and as we participate. So one of the things that I retained from this conversation was that the arts not only have the capacity to build bridges and help make connections and relations, but the arts also provide a positive vision of other worlds, of other ways of being. And they do this while also offering us a reality check about our changing world. And I think dialogue, as well as listening, within the arts sector and beyond, are key to moving forward. And that's why this event is so important, so useful. So I'd like to thank the organizers, the conversationalists, and participants for sharing their wisdom and their passions and their fears. And I hope we'll do it again soon.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about what you can expect from this conversation this afternoon. We're so glad that you've joined us. My name is Evalyn Parry. I use she, they pronouns, and I am a member of Public Imagination, a network, a group that I'm going to tell you a bit about in a moment. Before I do that, I just want to say a big welcome to everybody. We're happy for those of you who took part in this moment of embodied dancing, connecting to the place where you are. We're coming in from all over Turtle Island, all over the country. And I'm coming in today from the Cataraqui Kingston area. That is part of the Williams Treaty. And I want to acknowledge the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee folks whose traditional territory this is. And I want to acknowledge also that the land acknowledgement itself is a cultural practice, piece of cultural leadership that we've really taken up in this sector over the last decade or less, since the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action were published back in 2015. And I just want to acknowledge that there are 94 of those calls to action, and we in the arts and culture sector have taken up that one call in a great way that has become almost expected now at the beginning of a cultural event. And I just want to acknowledge the other 93 recommendations, and that is a living document still that needs the attention of all of us in our sector and in our land. So welcome again. Thank you very much to Mass Culture for partnering with us in today's event. And a reminder to everybody, you probably read this when you signed up. We are recording this conversation today, audio only, or well, we're actually recording the whole thing, but an audio only version of it is going to be available as a podcast following this through the Conscient podcast and our partnership with Claude Schreier, who's the producer of Conscient. So we'll be letting folks know. You'll be getting an email about that when it's available, but just to remind you that we're being recorded in that way, and that hopefully this conversation can spread beyond this room. So public imagination, a tiny little bit of background, and then we're going to get into the conversation. We are a group, I'll name the 8 members of this network: Shannon Litzenberger, Devyani Saltzman, Sherry Boyle, Kevin Loring, Kevin Ormsby, Leslie Ting, Greg Frankson, and myself, Evalyn Parry. Sherry Boyle is acting as our amazing chat moderator today, and Sherry's going to post a link to our brand new, very modest website that tells you a tiny bit about each of us and a bit about the aims of Public Imagination, which is a nascent group of multidisciplinary mid-career artists who came together about a year ago with a shared interest in how, in this time of global polycrisis and systems collapse, how could the creative methods, approaches, and practices of artists be usefully or experimentally applied to issues of public policy? And we're curious about the collective power of artists as world makers, as catalysts for new imaginaries, new ways of thinking and transforming our world, and interested in how we, as a group of 8 artists, but as artists in general, how artists may play a more active role in the process of reimagining and transforming society. So just a few small ideas. We've been meeting monthly over the past year together to think, to gather in conversation. And this is our first public-facing event. We're very glad that you're here to join with us. Our conversations together in the Public Imagination Network often circle back to issues of cultural leadership, since this is an arena that we all have a relationship with, whether as independent artists who make, lead, participate in projects in our various cultural and arts-based communities of practice, and also for some of us as past or present leaders of cultural institutions ourselves. We're also in a moment where there's a lot of talk about cultural collapse. And we thought this topic about cultural leadership would be a really good, potent place to start what we hope will be a continuing space for generative conversation, a series that we are calling Imagining in Public. We're so glad that you are here. And I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Shannon Litzenberger.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Evalyn. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you all some of our intentions for this session. So Public Imagination, like as we meet on a regular basis, we've been trying to model different ways of working and being together. And one of the foundations is really about how we explore topics in community and how we invite the ability to bring different perspectives, like in a context of plurality, that we're not a kind of like unified voice as a group. We're a collection of people in conversation from different perspectives. And we've been trying to model that and model, centering the perspective of the artist in these bigger systemic issues. We've been trying to model being in generative disagreement around things, using the power of our, observations and the sharpened antennae that artists have to inform public discourse. We try to allow ourselves to be thinking in draft, to kind of be rehearsing possible futures, to understand that now is a time of trying to ask better questions rather than have answers. We try to work in collaboration as much as we can. So working in pairs or trios amongst our group to do things like make decisions or explore an issue. We're also, in this conversation in particular, trying to lateralize relationships a little bit more across the ecosystem. And so, in this conversation, we are a group of artists in conversation with funders. And in the ecosystem, there's a stratification between those, the institution of the funder and the, work of the individual artist. And I think for this conversation, we're inviting a kind of humanizing process where all of us as people inside a system of cultural production are trying to think well, are trying to, move forward, are trying to transcend harmful dynamics of our field. And we all are humans that have ideas and have different locations and organizational or not positions in the field. So we're really trying to embody this in our work. And so our invitation to us as a collective that's gathered here today is to embody some of these intentions. So an intention of thinking in draft, of imagining better questions, and of centering our humanity together. So with that, I will pass over to Devyani to do some introductions. Thank you.
And we're just heading into our conversation momentarily, but I'd like to, in the spirit of what Shannon was saying, say that we are here today speaking as PIN and also with Michael Murray, the CEO of the Ontario Arts Council, and Kelly Langgard, the CEO of the Toronto Arts Council, and their bios will be in the chat, along with Shannon, Evalyn, myself, and Sherry, members of PIN. In terms of the format, this is very much a conversation and not a panel, and we're thinking of it in a round way. What's going to happen first is a quick framing question and a rapid fire amongst us of responses to that, and then two more questions. A member of PIN will pose that question and throw it to three of us as speakers to respond, and then we'll open it up to a chat storm. So Evalyn is going to just expand on what a chat storm is and how your voices are as much a part of this conversation as ours.
Yeah, we want to acknowledge, obviously, with so many people here in the room, which is fabulous to have all you here, but a hard number to have a real conversation on Zoom with. And so one of our proposals for today, in order to have some back and forth, is this chat storm, an idea that I got introduced to by Carla Stevenson, who is a facilitator of one of the awesome phase shift workshops offered by Mass Culture about a year ago. And it's simply a format where we want to try and not have a side conversation constantly happening in the chat, but rather save our time for chat to do it all at once. And so at the end of each round, there'll be 3 rounds where there's a question that's posed. The first one is a bit more rapid fire, and then the 2 longer conversations. At the end of each of those rounds, we'll invite everybody to make a response of some sort at that time altogether. And we'll give you a signal. So there'll be a moment where we'll be like, all right, write your thing in, but don't press send yet. And then we all press send together, and all the responses come in, and we take a couple minutes just to read and be together with what's happening in the chat. So we don't have to split our minds between the chat and the live conversation. So hopefully that's clear, and we'll remind you again when it comes up. We'll get a chance to practice soon. So with that, I am going to lead us into our framing or opening question here. And I do invite folks to think about this, because we'll invite you to chat storm after we hear from the panelists in response to this, or I shouldn't say our conversationalists. We'll move away from this panel language. The pandemic led us to acknowledge the need for transformational change, both in society at large and in our cultural sector. This moment that we're navigating now is one infused with the tension between the need for change and the desire for preservation. So our warm-up question is, from where you stand now, what are we needing to hold on to, and what are we needing to leave behind? I guess I'm going to throw this first to Devyani, if you're willing to start us off.
Yeah, sometimes called the suitcase question. What will you take in the suitcase? Right now, top of mind for me, as I'm about to go from working as a writer and artist into an institutional role in an organization that produces a lot of content over multiple disciplines, is letting go of urgency culture and the production mindset in presenting, and how that often just burns out teams and also is a lot for audiences to take in. So I'd like to kind of take forward less is more and leave behind that kind of productivity, urgency way of approaching artistic presentation.
Somebody else want to jump in? Kelly or Michael want to jump in? Great.
Yeah. I would say for me, solitary ways of working and the idea that there can be a singular definitive answer, I think is so critical now, always, but especially now that we work in collaboration in a really deep and authentic way. I would say hold on to the really firm belief that the arts matter more than ever now, and that connecting to the public and connecting with people's right to a creative life for every person is something we really need to hold on to as we move forward.
Gorgeous. Michael?
Yeah, when the pandemic hit, I was not here. I was at the Toronto Musicians Association, local 149 at the AFM. And my memory was, there was this common challenge, significant challenge that everyone was facing, and just really common circumstances all of a sudden. Didn't matter whether you were, a symphonic violinist or like a funk bassist in a touring band. No one could play, right? The next day, no one was going to their gig tomorrow. And so in this way, all of a sudden, it was a great challenge, but everyone was on facing the same challenge. And then everyone kind of got on the same page and was looking out for each other. And I thought that was, and I think there's still a spirit of that that's left in the arts, that everyone, we want to look at, we want to look after each other. And I think that spirit, to hold on to that, would be great. I'd say during the pandemic, we started to get more siloed and not be able to have those conversations with the basis of we're all facing the same challenge, because I really do think we are, not only in the music field, but every field. And so, hold on to that. We are facing the same basic challenges, and let go of, we cannot, we still need to have conversations that are hard, but can we go from understanding that we have the same overall challenges?
I mean, I might get in a bit of trouble for this one, but something I've been thinking about letting go of is this idea of problem solving, that it's just everywhere in our language, in our funding applications, in our thinking, in our conversations. And I just wonder if problem solving is one of the ways that we're staying coupled to a system that we are conditioned by, that we know. And that, to me, the opposite of problem solving orientation is an orientation of creation. Like when I think about the artist practice doesn't necessarily set out to solve problems. It sets out to bring something into existence. So this is something that's been occupying my thinking a little while, is what if we let go of the idea of solving problems and really try to think about what we want to create together. And in terms of what we want to hold on to, sorry, this one is a bit cheesy, but I think we need to more consciously hold on to the hope that change is possible. It can really get depressing when we think about the forces of the systems around us. But I feel that hope, through our own acknowledgements and self-awareness of how we are coupled to this system, and that we do have the ability to transform ourselves and therefore the world around us, then we need to not lose that hope and continue and be able to continue doing the work of change because of that hope. Thanks.
I would, building on all the answers that have come, for me, there's like a leaving behind is the model of singular heroic leadership. And that idea of saviors and people that can save organizations single-handedly. And the thing to cultivate, especially around arts leadership, cultural leadership, is more opportunities for learning, more opportunities for building skills, capacity, community connection. Like, it's the counterpoint to the singular heroic leadership model, is like, how do we build that capacity and build it into jobs, build it into budgets, being like lifting up leaders to learn and grow inside those roles. I think that is huge. And a tiny anecdote that I want to just share. For me, a highlight of the pandemic, which was a bad time all around, but a wonderful thing that came out of it in Toronto theater at that time was a bi-weekly meeting on Zoom of all the artistic directors of theaters in Toronto. And it was I don't know who organized it actually to begin with. I think it might have been Brendan at Canadian Stage in collaboration with somebody else. Anyways, it kind of was an open door invite. And it was such a unique, incredible space. And the revelation to me was how unique it was to see all those people gathered, where we would never have had time to gather, and we would never have prioritized the gathering. And the way that it shifted a kind of, away from our siloed, fairly competitive, supportive yet competitive field, and put us into a basket together where we were able to really exchange and talk about what we were struggling with and our strategies and how things were. And it was an amazing outcome that speaks to me of like, the stuff to leave and the stuff to cultivate. But I'll leave that there. And now it's going to be time for our first chat storm. So if you too have a response about what we're bringing forward and what we're leaving behind, type it in, and then we're going to press go in a moment. I'm going to give everybody like 30 seconds just to collect your thoughts and type your thing. And then I'll give you the signal. And then we'll take a minute to just read and have a little quiet time to read and think. So there's a lot to engage with here. And to keep moving, I will just acknowledge that we are saving the chat, and we're going to be able to circulate to all the folks who are signed up here, both the audio recording of the conversation and the saved chat. So I think I'm going to pass the baton to Shannon for our next question. And this is around for a more robust conversation.
All right, thank you. Wow, I'm already like really excited about all the responses that are pouring in. Okay, I'm going to divert my attention away from that and just share with you a bit of a setup for our next question. So something that I am very embroiled in is the idea of leadership as practice. So thinking about how like we're really in the paradigm of leadership that's already been coming up in this conversation, like we're still really working in this corporate industrial era operating model of organizing that really concentrates decision-making and resource allocation at this level of oversight. So we're kind of in a leadership as oversight model. But in our world and in the arts, systems of power are increasingly getting alienated from the experience of the frontline worker and the people they aim to serve, like actually in the space of practice, the space of the practitioner. And so this creates a tension where our practiced expertise that like it's distancing itself from the leader as overseer, and us as, leaders, or those of us who feel like we're exercising leadership, we are very, practiced in a form of leadership that's been born out of executive management style mindsets. So it's the MBA model, right? It's the leader as overseer MBA model of how we learn to lead. But how, are these practices aligned with the world that we say that we want to create? Are they really aligned with the distributed intelligences of an organization, through the collaboration of its team? Are they animating and learning from the relational practices that the front line is engaged in community with? And so if we do want to try to make this relational turn, so moving away from the hierarchical leader as overseer toward a more relational way of working, embodying a way of leading and organizing that acknowledges interdependence, that orients toward care, justice, sustainability, mutual thriving, instead of extraction, competition, hyperproduction, limitless growth, then what do we need to practice? What are the new leadership practices that we need to rehearse that are not yet embodied in us? What are the new muscles that we need to build? And I would love to know, because I don't think we're starting from zero. I believe that there are practices happening out there. And so I'm curious, what are the practices right now? And can I turn to Kelly to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Shannon, those are all such important questions. And I think, you've done so much thinking in this area. I've learned a lot from you and the conversations that we've had. I think, for me, I'm fairly newish in my role at the Toronto Arts Council and Foundation as the CEO there. We have this sort of management model, this traditional management model, but at the same time, we also have this model of our peer assessment, our peer review processes, where the organization is constantly bringing in artists and arts professionals and engaging in conversations and dialogue about the decisions that we make around our funding allocations. And I think that for me, that's inspiration of how we can work differently also internally in our organization, and how I lead and how I work with my colleagues. So I said at the beginning that I'm a firm believer in collaboration as a way forward. I've always actually worked in that way. And I think it comes from a really deep belief that I don't have all the answers, and nor should I. And that the best way to move forward is to work together to bring multiple perspectives to the table, to make that space for the best decisions to be made, which can only really be made when everyone is sort of part of the process. So yeah, I would say that that value of collaboration, authenticity, making sure that there's a diversity of voices around the table, that we really champion this new model and new ways of working. Because it's one thing to do it, it's another thing for people to recognize it as leadership. And so I want to recognize that and call it what it is when I see other people doing it, and hopefully that's reciprocated.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I want to just name another tension as well, which is that, in this moment when things are not going well, there is a kind of grasping that's happening, and it's a desire for control, which is a completely human thing, right? I mean, we're not that open to novelty and change and new experiences when we feel threatened, like when the survival of our organizations might be threatened. And I feel like this is a tension that is really at play right now, and that we need to be gentle with ourselves as we, and try to build new habits that allow for these different kinds of practices to come forward, because it's scary. It's scary to start being differently right now, because we're very practiced in the old way, and we think that, hanging on tightly is what is going to get us through. So I just want to name that tension, and maybe Devyani, I'll invite you to chime in next.
Yeah, no, I think it's so true. And as you said, it's kind of when things are in panic or crisis management in the kind of MBA model, we go to command and control, and we've witnessed that in a number of arts orgs. And as you said, that can lead to retrenchment. So how do we actually slow down even when our instinct says clutch tightly? And you and I have spoken a little bit about that. Somebody mentioned in the chat kind of performative professionalism, which is to look like you're in control and you're leading well, you seize the moment and, helm the ship. But how do you actually like take a deep breath and in the spirit of embodied leadership, kind of quiet the nervous system and actually have a conversation? So we just had, as I'm entering the Barbican, a time sensitive thing happened, and I had to kind of practice remotely with the team in London saying, why don't we just take a moment? Like, why are we rushing? Let's just think through this. And we don't have to stick to the marketing models where it has to be out today. Why don't we put it out in 10 days and actually have some really serious conversations? And my whole body resisted that, but I realized I had to practice this, and everyone felt like deep breath, again, moving away from having to show leadership as power, from performative professionalism, from urgency culture. And I think the result, hopefully everyone was much happier with, because they could collectively input. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's actually in like the smallest moments to resist that PMC, professional managerial model, and try to practice relational, slower, humane ways of being.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? We still have some time. So Evalyn, if you want to get in on this, please do.
Well, I wasn't sure I was going to be responding to this question. So I've been just thinking about questions actually for people, and I'm interested, Kelly, you raised the idea of like ambiguity about recognition of like the qualities that you're naming about leadership. Like, can you talk more about, have you experienced resistance or like a lack of acknowledgement in your own practice of people like being like having different expectations of you or resisting a kind of collaborative style? Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll also say that, sometimes it's real, sometimes maybe it's just perceived or a worry I have, that when you come in with a certain sort of softer style of leadership, where you're asking for people's input, that that it might be perceived as, well, you don't know the answer, and so you have to ask somebody else, or you're leaning on someone else to make a decision, yeah, I think people expect of a leader, whether they know it or not, as this sort of visionary, where you said that heroic leader, who's going to come in with a really strong vision and turn things around and make things happen, and sort of galvanize people and forces and partners. And I think you can actually do that much more effectively by listening, by engaging, by taking your time, as you say, Devyani, to get it right. Also recognizing that you might never get it right, and that the process is just as important. So yeah, I think that those things are all fairly new in terms of what people consider to be effective leadership, and so that's why I say it's useful to call it leadership as often as possible when you see other people doing it, to call it leadership, because that's ultimately what it is, and I think more effective than many of the approaches that we've seen in the past.
I love that. So like the practice in a way that you're naming is about acknowledging and naming and renaming in a way that's kind of like, I was thinking before about land acknowledgement and how the practice of land acknowledgement has changed me in the time that I was artistic director at Buddies. It was like in the early days before everybody was doing it. And I remember the kind of resistance that I met, of people like being baffled by what I was doing in this pre-show announcement. They didn't understand, and some weird conversations with people in the lobby. And then, within a year, 2 years, 3 years, like there's a more common understanding, and it's become a new protocol. And there's probably like, I don't want to get into a like debate on the effectiveness of that thing, because of course, like, it's words more than action in a sense, but there's something about the learning that for me has been like the process of like doing a land acknowledgement has been a thing of acknowledging where I am, having to learn when I travel, when I tour, learning to say new words and learn some history and make some new connections. So it's been a kind of, it's been a practice of acknowledgement, expanding this idea of like what we acknowledge, what should be acknowledged, how can we make that wider?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I love this notion of leadership as well. And I think, leadership, this is one of the words that has so many different definitions. And we also create identifiers with leadership, as in there are leaders, like individuals who are leaders. And this is also, like, to me, a bit antithetical to the idea that maybe leadership is not about the individual. Like maybe leadership is about a productive dynamic that arises between people working together in all their uniquenesses towards some kind of shared aim. Maybe leadership is about an attunement to the environment and an ability to respond well in service of a kind of collective thriving. Like there are so many ways to think about leadership that are, I think, not embodied in the leader as overseer kind of, or the leader as visionary, or the leader as hero. Like the answer haver is the leader somehow. But anyways, Michael, I want to get you in on this, just give you some space to offer some comments too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think in organizing training, I learned that a leader is someone who people follow. So I think this really depends on the people, right? So I think what I'm hearing and what I've heard and what I know about the arts is that there are different styles of leadership that work in different spaces, but the majority of the styles that work are more collaborative, are more facilitating. And I think what's cool happening in the world, like technological change, offers some new opportunities to put in new models. Like I'm thinking as something like platform co-ops. I don't know if you ever heard of Smart in Belgium or something like that, right? But this is a completely different way of just being and functioning. Where, oh yeah, Robert, I just saw Robert Sauvé nod because it is a little bit like Duo put into an app, because it's a it's an idea of every person has facilitated, but there's a central body that's facilitating your practice. That's making sure you have insurance. That's making sure you can bill people, but still qualify for government backing plans, etc. So it's very cool, and I think that calls whoever the leader of Smart is. It calls for a completely different kind of leader because you truly do not have, even if you wanted to have the control paradigm, you don't have control, right? You are just there to facilitate, just what we talked about, right? To facilitate each member's success, and then there's something around collectivism and making sure that the changes happen, people buy in. So I think there's a lot of room, and I think there's a lot of desire from the arts. I know there was a whole conversation whether we should talk about the arts as a sector in the last conversation, which is really getting my head going. But yeah, I think in the arts there's a lot of desire for collective leadership, for a leader that really fosters the collective, fosters each organization, each individual artist, sometimes collectives, not so much defined, having success using the best tools, and then navigating this world, this corporate government, whatever, give me all the tools and to navigate this world to make sure I have the equal benefits to the rest of society, but also give me the freedom to, especially as an artist, to freedom to create and express ideas. And I think that's the ideal right now. I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you. So I think we're going to transition to the chat storm now. And so Sherry is going to post a more succinct version of this question about practices of leadership in the chat for us. And so same thing, type them in and don't hit send yet. We'll give you like 30 seconds to put your thoughts in, and then we'll say go in a few moments.
Okay, going into our third question before we open the floor to questions at the end of this conversation. Many cultural organizations, as we know, are in a state of flux and turmoil, especially around the politics of this moment and also financial instability or stability. A number are actually on the verge of collapse. What is the role of institutions, yeah, no small question, to its publics and the responsibility of leadership in those internal positions? How do leaders stay ethical in relationship to the world around us? And I'm going to maybe start with, I don't know if Kelly, I think you started the last one. I feel badly, but I'm going to start with you, Kelly.
Okay. Well, I was thinking actually as an add-on to the last question, which maybe also applies here, that, it's so important. It's really so important to think about who you're serving. And for us, for the Toronto Arts Council as a funder, that's both artists and the public. And then to think about what leadership practices are the most suited to serving those artists and that public well. And I don't know how direct I will be in answering a question in this way, but I'm thinking that getting better at listening, getting better at sitting in a place of learning is important. I think about also back to the notion of collaboration. I want to work in concert with other funders and in a conversation with other funders. I know Michael and I exchange information often, and also with the Canada Council for the Arts, because I know that that by trying as much as possible to align some of our systems and some of our requirements, it will make that easier on the artists we're serving. And now I'm getting a feeling like I'm getting off track a little bit, but I think it's important to be in this position of sort of constantly bringing your public, the people you're serving, to the front of your mind and the decisions that you're making, so that you can kind of remain sort of ethical and honest and authentic in the way you work. Maybe I'll leave it like there for now, and I probably have more to add later. Sure. Thanks.
I'll pass it on to Evalyn.
Well, I guess what I am thinking about is like the feeling of impossible situations, impossible dilemmas, impossible tensions where there's no right answer, where you're going to piss somebody off no matter what stance you take or policy you make. And I feel like I am taking like an extended break from leadership, in part because of like the strain of being faced with impossible situations in my leadership position that I held for 5 years at Buddies. It was like, just the kind of, and it goes back, it connects with all these conversations we're having about the model of leadership too, and how like leaders are targeted for needing to come up with answers to things that it's like, and in the arts, the like crazy irony that the arts are supposed to come up with answers to like political solutions that our political leaders can't come up with answers for. And yet we have a kind of like pressure from our constituents in the arts, the artists, the publics, to take positions and make statements in a way that almost like endows the arts with, I don't know, I say this with, I'm thinking in draft, but like it endows the arts with too much power, more power than we have, even though I'd like us to have that kind of power. But do we have that power? Like if the government is not making policy about, who they're selling weapons to or whatever, anyway, it's so complex. I don't think there's any easy answers here. And I guess it comes back to so much of what's being reflected about of like pause and the need for collaboration and a kind of like different models of responding. And it comes back to this question of problem solving too, I guess, that Shannon brought up. So I don't have answers, but those are the things that are popping in this conversation for me. but why don't I pass to
Happy to
Michael?
go. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that. And I think creating the room, the institutions need to create the room for the voices to be heard. I think that's what the expectation is. And my experience over the past little while has been when people feel heard, it really changes everything. There's the I have an issue, and then there's second the underlying thing around this, or we have an issue, and the underlying piece is, and I don't think we're getting heard, or I don't think I'm getting heard. And then as soon as there's this moment of, oh, at least I was heard. Whether anyone agrees, whether it's your role to agree or not agree, or whether it's this other group's role to agree or not agree, as soon as folks feel heard, then I think it's a whole different situation. And I think that's that's it, the role of the leader and the role of the institution to model that, to find places that are safe, maybe safe. I've learned about safe, not necessarily comfortable, places to have ideas heard. We have a huge advantage, Kelly and I. We have panels, right? We have the juries, which are confidential, community-led spaces, right? Where various points of view can be heard and considered, and that's been very useful. I've always appreciative and thankful for a peer assessment model, but never so much as now. Between everything listed in this question, financials and politics, etc., it gives us time and a structure for ideas to be heard and for ways to think about things and move forward. So if you don't run an arts council, or if you are not part of a collective that has that system, I just think coming up with a model for spaces that are safe, again, not necessarily comfortable, for that to happen, that's a huge asset. That's what I would say.
Just jumping in, I think a lot about permeability and as you said, listening in spaces for those conversations to happen. I do want to put out that I responded to somebody had put in the ability to let go of spaces that are institutions founded in white supremacy or colonialism. And there is some part of me that says, even as certain organizations and certain legacy spaces are more permeable, are they still able, I'm just putting out there, to be safe spaces rooted in those ethics? I don't know. These are things I think about myself. And somebody else put out kind of, even if an organization is listening, the pay discrepancies between, in the old traditional leadership model, the kind of the hierarchy, senior management, et cetera, and workers. And I think that's a really valid point. In what we're talking about as maybe leadership in a more collective way, I think it is that kind of consultative internally and consultative with your constituents that is so key to kind of hopefully living into an ethic of service, like seva, as in the Hindi concept of service, which to me is a guiding principle in how one works when one is in spaces with delivering services or funds or programming to constituents. That wasn't very elegant, but that was my attempt. And now I'm going to invite everyone to take a moment for the chat storm as well, and I'll give you the go in a second. So think on it.
Yes, if you've had a chance to read through and would like to start thinking about some questions, feel free to post those questions now in the chat, and Sherry is going to sort of review and bring some of them forward, maybe thematically. Let's just see what comes up. But where you, our audience, where do you want to take this conversation now?
Sherry, while you're doing that, I just want to say Kate, I really like your comment about transformational leadership and the sort of mindset of rising all boats.
Yeah, there's so many questions here that are interesting, but there's also so much that's happened in the chats that are really worth like engaging more deeply. So it's really tricky for me to actually pull one of these questions. In a way, I was interested in someone that Sasha said earlier, wondering about how exactly are we defining leaders in this conversation, which is something we never really looked at the very beginning, about what is leadership and how do we define that. And in terms of cultural leadership specifically, are we modeling something? Are we learning, or as Sasha said, referencing bell hooks, thinking more about learning communities or modeling approaches. That's of interest in a way to me. Maybe we could start a conversation while I get another couple questions going about how to actually even define leadership, or how do you self-define that?
I could jump in with just it's not exactly answering your question, but to say like something that has come up in our conversations with public imagination when we were bandying about what the topic would be for this session was like, well, what is cultural leadership too? Like not even what's leadership, but like cultural leadership. This is like, and this feels like it's an arts leadership conversation. Is that the same as cultural leadership? Are we like conflating this big idea about like, yeah, people are leading culture in all kinds of ways, not just in the arts. And so what is the arts place inside of cultural leadership, I guess? Not an answer, more questions.
Shannon, I feel like you have a lot to say about this. I'd love to hear you talk.
I mean, in the spirit of thinking in draft, I could share, like, I have a little bit of like a working definition of leadership, and I really feel like it's a work in progress. It's not specific to cultural leadership, but I think about leadership as, let me see if I can like do this from memory, but as our ability to respond generatively to what a moment is asking of us in service of collective thriving. So it's got a lot of layers to it. And this definition has arisen from like more than a decade of doing leadership development work in different kinds of communities, including in the arts. But it's about, our ability to respond. What are we responding to? How are we attuning to a moment? Like, are we just seeing what we're conditioned to see? Are we attuned to what's in the foreground, the arrangements in the background that are producing the condition that we're inside of? And are our decisions, are our responses, are they in service of collective thriving? And I think to me, this is the big moment of relational turn that leadership needs to understand now, that the dynamic of leadership needs to understand, because leadership in a corporate model is about missions. It's about achieving a mission. And it's not that we don't have collective aims that we want to achieve, but at what cost? At the cost of employee health and well-being, at the cost of the environment, at the cost of our sense of community, like at what cost? And so when you add in this layer of relationality, of collective thriving, then our decisions have many layers of relationship to consider. Are we in right relationship, like with ourselves, with each other, with the missions that we're serving, with the environment that we're in, with our, planetary health? Like there are all these layers. So those, I mean, whatever, leadership is not definitively any one thing, but this is what has been generated in my practice, through my practice, these elements of attunement, responsiveness, and right relationship.
Sherry has fielded a few from the chat just to raise for the group. And one is in the role of institutions, somebody had asked, I'm curious to what will happen when political leadership changes and the risk of backslide, because there may not be priorities around the arts and its place in this social change. I don't know if Kelly and Michael, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find that question again. Do you mind just reading it again, Devyani?
Sure. In terms of institutions, I'm curious as to what will happen when the political leadership will change, and if we will end up going backwards if the government leadership changes, because there may not be priorities around the arts and its place in the changes we're discussing.
Mhm. Well, something that I've been thinking about a lot is because we have a very good sense that the government is likely to change at the federal level, um, is the importance of connecting the value of the arts to everyday citizens, to and their own connection to creativity, whatever that might be. I think it's something we should be working on now. It's something that we should be talking about, not only within our communities and within the arts sector, but outside of as well. Talking about the value of the arts to things like feelings of belonging and feelings of connection, and the ability to build bridges that the arts so uniquely has, and artists are able to do. I think that cultural leadership is uh, the idea of cultural leadership is also about doing things differently, from that place of creativity um, and creation. And so, if our sector can bring that to the table in a meaningful way that connects with the public, then I think that we'll be much better off um, when a government might come into power that doesn't believe in the arts, because um, they'll hear from citizens that they care.
Michael?
Yeah, I think I kind of want to go back to my answer to the first question for this one, which is, in that pandemic, everyone was on the same team, for a moment. It didn't, political parties didn't matter, and the kind of art you make didn't matter. And I'm not saying there will be moments like that just from political change, but I would challenge people to kind of have those moments of like, what if what if it didn't matter? How would I act if it truly didn't matter that, let's say there was a political change, how who would I engage with right now? How would I engage them? I think that's probably the approach the arts really needs to take, is to drop all, leave the assumptions behind, and have a moment where in times of big change that's an opportunity for new conversations with new people. Maybe they're not so new, right? Like, it's another assumption that needs to change, is um really try to I believe in the power of the arts for everyone. And I like to think every single person in the world loves the arts. And I think I've never met someone who doesn't. I've never met someone who doesn't love a singer, or love a piece of music, or a musical, or a piece of art, or I mean the arts are, or a dish, culinary arts. So there's always a way for me in my head to chart someone to become to realize they already are a lover of the arts. And so then I think that's what I would hope for, in a situation where, even if you're perceiving, oh no, like the structures we have, which we all just said, we're not in love with the structures we have right now. So you have someone who, you have a political scene that comes by and also doesn't like those structures for whatever reason. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe that's a big opportunity to kind of group together as as everyone's lover of the arts, and move forward. I'm being a bit facetious, but I know it's not easy to do, but I think it is I think that's what you have to see it as, an opportunity.
I mean, I also wonder if I can just jump in, like, this is a little bit, you know, a bit of a trap I feel like we get into in the arts is that we limit our thinking to the system of cultural production and the policies and support structures that kind of envelop us when we think about politics. Like when we think about a new government, we get worried about the CBC getting cut, we get worried about the Canada Council being cut, we get worried about policy change and losing in the structures that we're in. And then we get to work at trying to react to that by mounting advocacy campaigns, by working on narratives and messaging, and that is all super important and part of the process acting in solidarity for our welfare as a system of cultural production. But I think the turn that the arts sector hasn't fully made is that we have a profound relevance to society in this moment that goes well beyond the art that we make. That art as a process has something to offer education, has something to offer healthcare, has something to offer urban design, has something to offer the whole web of social structures that are experiencing the same things that the system of cultural production is experiencing, which is leadership challenges, which is a collapse of supports, which is an increased demand for services in terms of like the help that's needed. And so, I feel like I've been singing this song for a long time, but I believe that art has processes that are capable of transforming our relationships to self, each other, and the world around us. And those processes do not have to only lend themselves to making art that inspires people to engage with art. Like, I think that those processes can help transform how society is organized right now. And the policies and funding structures for that might need to start transcending the notion of holding together a system of cultural production. Like, where are there other relationships with other sectors of society that the arts could develop that would see resources flow in support of artistic processes engaging with these larger social questions in this moment? And I do feel like those processes are different than the problem-solving processes that are often at play, because these processes are about emergence. They're about creation. So when they're about creation, they don't get instrumentalized as solving problems. They actually contribute to catalyzing new public imaginaries. And to me, that is the value of the arts. It's a being-based, emergent creative orientation in the world. And so when I think about like a change in government, I think, well, who are our allies across sectors, and where could we see other ways of mobilizing the value of art as a process?
I'm just fielding from Sherry some of the questions, so we're trying to get to a few more of them. So I'm just going to go for another one for a second, and then if anyone wants to jump back into that. How do we collect all the progress and all the progress being made around change in this country, and how do we share it in a way that actually helps engage, enlighten, and help others make that change? So are there networks of these conversations? How are we actually sharing learnings and moving forward? I think, Shannon, you and I have talked a little bit about kind of, I believe, like solidarity and change, and needing that kind of critical mass. Or when you're in a team or an organization, you're trying to shift a way of being that's more relational. It often, I think Tim Sonova at Work Shouldn't Suck and Katrina Donald have talked about this. It's almost those mini experiments in teams and organizations that push for change and solidarity momentum for organizational shifts. So how do we collect all the progress and change being made and share it across this country? Does anyone know of things that they can share? I don't know if Michael or Evalyn or Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, the co-host, one of the Mass Culture, is doing some great work. Liz is on this call too. Liz at OTF has a whole bunch of stuff. There's almost too much energy right now, I would say, right? Like, we have multiple data projects and collectives that have started up in the arts to tell data stories. And we're not, interestingly enough, we're really into numbers and data right now. And we're not, I would say, I'm sorry, I'm giving opinion. I guess that's what I'm doing anyway. I say we're not as good at qualitative right now. And I've always been a big numbers. I like numbers a lot. But now I'm starting to feel like the gap, because I can tell you the audiences for funded orgs for the last 20 years from OAC, but I can't even give you 10 full band success stories from like where OAC was involved in the seed grant and then had the story of this part of growth and where that went to an international partnership. I love Mahabharata. Why not Mahabharata? But I've told it now about 75 times because it's the one story I have of the full band. So we haven't collected those kinds of stories. So yeah, I think if the collectivism gets going with art service organizations, with mass culture, with the Arts Council's partnership, just that same idea of leadership, of always thinking about someone else. Kelly's amazing at this. It's like, let's not just do this on our own and try to, I'm not here to make myself look good. I'm here to like make the arts move forward. So the more collectivism we have in general, the more we'll just naturally share some stories, and then we can maybe do some formal structures. So we're up for it for sure. There's a gathering in Calgary right now, actually, that's all about this. So hopefully they're going to come back with some amazing tidbits.
Thank you. I'm going to throw in another question just because there's so many good ones, and I do want to bring as many other voices. This is from Hema. I'm curious how you are all thinking about the shifting nature of the artist from a full-time profession and community to more of a decentralized and democratized practice of creation as one part of life, often due to precarity, and what that means for the future of cultural production and institutions. And I feel, Shannon, you might have a lot to say on this, and that's a great question.
Maybe someone else can start on this one. Actually, I feel like I've been talking a bit too much.
Sure. Evalyn, do you want to go on that one?
I'm just rereading the question here. I don't know. The thing that I've been thinking about, I don't know if this is gonna, again, thinking in draft, claiming that space to just think in draft and be like on my feet with thinking through the question and the things that are just kind of popping in my brain from all the stuff that's incoming here. I'm thinking about this metaphor that I spent a lot of time recently. I had the chance to do my master's and take a lot of time for reading and thinking. And one of the quotes that kind of guided my study was a Marshall McLuhan quote, which sort of seemed like laughably out of date in a certain way and then incredibly prescient in all these amazing ways. It's a quote from the 60s that says, the arts are a distant early warning system telling the old culture what is beginning to happen to it. Art at its most, anyway, I should know this. I'm a little nervous and now I'm forgetting the whole quote. Anyway, it's about the idea of like arts as prescient and also and arts as a bellwether and arts as, you know, the canary in the coal mine and arts revealing to the culture like where the overculture is going, where the other culture. It's like arts as leading culture. So now I'm thinking about this. I'm trying to think with that idea and this question that's been posed of like what the things that we're observing. And I think this is where Public Imagination Network has been like really such a generative space for me because it feels like we're able to be because of our kind of cross-disciplinary, like the places people are coming from, we always come together and like there's so much exchange happening and it starts to feel like an antenna system. Like we're putting together our collective antenna and trying to get a vibe on what's happening, which I think is the thing that the arts generally can do for us if we're reading it. You know, if we're tuned to reading what those signs are, we'll see how they play out later. So I'm thinking about how precarity is a piece that sticks out to me in this question. And, you know, like, obviously, it's not just the arts that are in precarity, like jobs at large, the way that that so many pieces that touch policy about housing and inflation and AI and like all these factors that are putting so many people into precarity in a way that maybe they hadn't experienced in their lifetime. And so the arts are bellwethering that we're seeing something. Maybe you used to be able to maintain a career based on more whatever, that there was maybe less people in the artist pool and more funding in the pool. And now like there's maybe 3 times as many applications, I believe, coming into arts councils for the same or less amount of funding. Like, how do we fund elder senior artists who've had a whole career? Like that becomes precarious if you can't support the generation who've come before. Like, do we have to move toward more corporate models? Aren't the corporations the problem in this whole enterprise anyway? Like, I don't know. I'm just, I'm like jamming here. Somebody else should join in.
I'll share 2 quotes. That's all I'm going to do is that Joe Green, who was a prof at York U for a long time, he's passed now. And I'll never forget when he said the arts are a great way to make a killing and an awful way to make a living. And I think that's still true today, unfortunately. And I think that artists suffer from that mentality. I don't think it's a healthy mentality, but it's true. You can have big, successful corporate things that happen but it's harder to make a sustainable career. But the other thing that's more exciting for me is the possibility of AI, is the possibility of, we think a lot about AI replacing some artistic roles, but I think artistic roles could be really quite resilient. Many artistic roles could be quite resilient and irreplaceable, I like to think. And there's an author named Joanna, I'm gonna not get her name right, Machuska, and she said something like, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes. And I think, but there is something there. There's something like maybe AI can help organize a bunch of things for us so that we can actually do more. And I think that revolution coming is a pretty big deal. And I don't understand enough about AI, but I want to understand more about how it frees us up to do the things we want to do.
I could jump in unless you want to go to another question, Devyani.
No, go for it, Shannon.
Well, just because AI is coming up now, my brain is turning on something else that I wanted to say earlier, which is about the role of the artist and the artist's antennae, and this notion that, like, so we live in a hyper rationalist culture that really values and utilizes data and information to inform decision making, and what data as information doesn't do as well as the embodied intuitive processes that artists engage in creation is actually make meaning of things, make sense of things, make meaning of things. And so I feel like we're on an interesting precipice with AI, where AI is doing these, like, you know, hyper computational acts, like predicting patterns and kind of mobilizing a type of information in a certain way. And what to me is like missing from that picture is the embodied sense and meaning making process, which, you know, if we think about the art's value, then we bring this value into, you know, an accelerating technological world that AI by itself, I mean, like many critics have talked about how poorly that function is named as artificial intelligence. It's like advanced pattern prediction is really more what it's doing. And so how we treat knowledge, how we understand what knowledge is, how we lean into wisdom even beyond, you know, data is not knowledge, data is information. And so how we make sense of these things, I think, is another role that the arts have to play, and that we can't mistake the information that AI is giving us as knowledge. I mean, we did an interesting experiment at our PIN meeting. We have a monthly meeting, so we met on Monday and we asked AI to take notes for us. And within the first, like, we had a human person, Sherry, took notes as well. And so within the first 3 sentences, there were like 5 inaccuracies in you know, AI listening to our conversation and trying to make sense of it. And of course, it takes a human to come back and make sense and meaning of what we were talking about. And so anyways, I am not making a case against AI, but understanding that it is one aspect that could inform what we understand as knowledge. But the meaning making process is actually the more sophisticated form of intelligence. And we need to not forget that that is an embodied process that we as human beings, as creative human beings, need to engage as we engage with AI. Okay, that was my little rant. Sorry.
We have time for one last question, and I'm just going to pose it from the group, and then I think we'll be Shannon and Evalyn and myself will help you in the wrap up. But now I'm just going to find this question, but it was around kind of, again, that definition of kind of institutions as the perspective of from institutions. But if institutions disappear or morph into something else, how do we then define the arts? Is what's surfaced.
That mean we are defining the arts in relation to institutions?
I think it does define it. I don't know who's written this, but if I think it does suggest that the arts as an ecosystem is generally been defined by institutions. I think we all know that is changing rapidly. But if institutions disappear, morph into something else, how do we define the arts?
I was just thinking about some of us were listening to Canada Land recently had an episode that was about cultural collapse, which I recommend people like have a listen to. It's interesting. And Jesse Wente who's the chair of the Canada Council, was speaking quite eloquently to that question, I thought, around like this equation between culture and institutions, as if culture didn't belong, wasn't happening on this land before buildings were made of stone and things were put in them to be displayed. And, you know, just reminding us of that colonial context and way that we've too often defined what culture is, art as well as culture. He was sort of talking big picture culture.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that it's really, the idea of of institutions defining what culture is, or a Canadian culture, idea of Canadian culture collapsing, that it depends so much on where you sit and what your perspective is. From where I sit, I see so much going on, so much that has always been going on across such a broad and diverse range of practices and identities and positions. And so, all of this together is meaningful together. It's so rich and full. I think that, culture, arts and culture, and all of it in all of its very many diverse forms will always continue to exist and should not be defined by institutions.
I should preface this by saying I'm a huge art fan. Like I go to I just love everything I see, and so I'd be an awful critic. I'd be a really awful art critic. And I recently went to the Stratford Festival opening, and there were like, I'd say that's an institution, Stratford Festival. And there was lots of kind of ceremony before, and there was something afterwards, and there was, you had to get the idea is you dress up. I'm not great at dressing up either. And so all of this around it was one thing. And then I got to the actual performance, which was 12th night. And it's just it was so incredible to me. Like the actual piece of art, the performances, just the performance, not the gala dinner before, this after. And then I thought, okay, well, why did I just go through all of these other things to get to the thing that was really great? And I think because those things facilitate that really great performance. There's something very unique about that performance that takes a certain collection of energy and resources, etc. So I think there's a certain kind of art that would go away, a really valuable kind of art that would go away without institutions, but there would be a lot of great art left. Absolutely, right? There would be a lot of, I don't know, what's the opposite of that? A 1 a.m. jam session in a kitchen on a third floor apartment in Montreal. Like that's a different kind of art that's amazing too. And so I don't think art would ever leave us, but there would be a certain kind of art that wouldn't be as accessible or as frequent. And I think it would be changed. I think it would be something lost, something pretty incredible lost. But I could absolutely see the point of view that says, no, nothing lost. There's still amazing, different kinds of art here.
Just throwing on my own opinion for a second, maybe it is about kind of just modes of delivery morphing. And I think Zara, if she's still on this call, we've talked a lot, Zara Ibrahim, have talked a lot about kind of that ecosystem and the canopy of those large institutions. And as some of them die away or burn down, they're also creating generative spaces for new models and different types of practices of how we share culture and art. And it's the both coexisting in that type of forest metaphor that might be a nice way of thinking about it. So not just that it has to be one or the other, but that it's kind of a continuum of change and morphing that also allows new ways of delivering those types of experiences to come up. But I will stop there and throw it to whoever wants to have the last word before we close.
Well, unless there's like, if Kelly or Michael, if you have a last word you'd like to add to the convo, the floor is yours. Otherwise, I think we will just do a final little closing thing.
Just thank you for inviting me. It's been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for everyone coming and the chat. There's something that's going to be shared. I think Claude's sharing something, which you'll talk about, which I look forward to.
Yeah, I'll just say I've appreciated this conversation. And actually, it's great because I feel like for weeks and months, we've been talking about dire situations in the arts. And I feel like this conversation has actually been very optimistic. And I appreciate all of the ideas that have been shared.
Well, thank you both so much, Kelly and Michael, for making time and allowing us, putting yourselves in the somewhat vulnerable position of an open-ended conversation that we invited you into, and we really appreciate it. And I feel like many seeds have been planted today, and a really multi-dimensional, rich conversation has happened, both through in conversation in words on the screen and through this amazing chat. I want to let folks know we will be sharing the chat with everybody who's here, so you'll all have a chance to see that. A question did come up about like, how are we planning to use the chat? And honestly, we hadn't considered that, Pin, in advance of this conversation. So I do think we'll get back to you in some way. Like, it won't be just shared without people's permission in any way. I want to just state that. And there will be a podcast courtesy of the wonderful Claude Schreier. Thank you so much for partnering with us, Claude. And please check out his amazing podcast. It's very rich, especially around issues of climate and art, which we didn't get to today at all, but there's a deep well there in lots of long-form conversations. And just in closing, we are going to put on some music and let people dance their way out. If you want to stay with us, leave your screen on or off. You can dance it out. And if you would like, we could have a final little chat storm with like a couple words that you're leaving with today, a sentence, anything that you want to share as you leave. So thank you again, everybody, for coming, and especially Robin to Mass Culture for hosting us and all your assistance with that. Thanks, everyone.